I believe this is where the story becomes far more interesting than most people realize, because the moment human neurons in the laboratory dish began adapting to a simple game of Pong, we were no longer looking at biology as a passive collection of cells. We were witnessing behavior that forces us to ask deeper questions about learning, intelligence, and the hidden potential embedded within life itself. When researchers observed these neurons adjusting their activity to improve performance, many people focused on the technological achievement. I found myself drawn toward a different question. What does this reveal about the nature of awareness at its most fundamental level? Of course, we must be careful with our language. A cluster of neurons playing Pong is not evidence of human consciousness sitting inside a petri dish. The experiment does not prove self-awareness, identity, or subjective experience, yet it does reveal something remarkable. Even outside the body, neurons appear driven toward meaningful adaptation. This observation challenges assumptions that many of us have carried for generations. We often imagine intelligence as something that emerges only after enough complexity has accumulated. We picture consciousness as a final product, appearing near the top of a biological hierarchy. But what if some of the organizing principles we associate with intelligence exist much earlier than we thought? Ancient traditions from many cultures have long suggested that life possesses an intrinsic tendency toward order, connection, and adaptation. Modern science uses different language, yet the themes sometimes seem surprisingly similar. Again and again, researchers discover that living systems are not merely reacting to the world around them. They are constantly interpreting, predicting, adjusting, and reorganizing. The neurons in this experiment were not following a rigid script. They were responding to feedback. They were adapting to consequences. They were changing their behavior based on experience. At the most basic level, this is what learning looks like. And that realization invites us to reflect on our own lives. Every day, our nervous system is doing something similar. Long before we consciously analyze an event, networks of neurons are evaluating patterns, detecting significance, and preparing responses. Much of what we call personality emerges from these ongoing biological conversations. This is where belief enters the discussion in a profound way. Many people think beliefs exist only as abstract thoughts floating through the mind, yet every belief we repeatedly reinforce becomes associated with physical neural pathways. Over time, these pathways become familiar routes through which energy and information travel. The brain is not simply storing ideas, it is embodying them. If I repeatedly tell myself that I am incapable, my nervous system gradually learns that pattern. If I repeatedly focus on possibility, resilience, and growth, different pathways become strengthened. The biology begins reflecting the mental environment in which it operates. The Pong experiment offers a fascinating metaphor. Those neurons improved because feedback allowed them to distinguish between less effective and more effective patterns. Human beings experience a similar process. Every emotion, every relationship, every challenge provides information. Whether we realize it or not, our nervous system is continuously learning from the signals we give it. This brings us to the relationship between emotion and biology. For decades, emotions were often treated as secondary experiences, important psychologically but separate from physical functioning. Today, research increasingly reveals that emotional states influence hormones, immune responses, cardiovascular health, and neural activity. The body listens to the language of emotion. When we experience chronic fear, stress-related systems remain activated. When we experience safety, connection, and meaning, entirely different biological processes become available. The chemistry changes, the nervous system changes, even patterns of gene expression can shift. What fascinates me is that these discoveries suggest the boundary between mind and body may be far more permeable than we once imagined. Rather than existing as separate domains, they appear deeply intertwined. Thought influences feeling. Feeling influences biology. Biology influences perception. Perception influences thought. A continuous loop emerges. The neurons in a dish offer a simplified glimpse into this principle. Their behavior changed through interaction with information. Human beings operate within vastly more complex networks, yet the underlying lesson remains powerful. Life responds to experience, and if life responds to experience, then the quality of our experience matters. Not only the events that happen to us, but the meaning we assign to them. Two individuals can encounter the same challenge and emerge with entirely different biological and psychological outcomes. One interprets the event as evidence of limitation. The other sees an opportunity for growth. The external circumstance may be identical, yet the internal response creates very different pathways. This does not mean we can simply think our way out of every difficulty. Reality is more nuanced than that. However, it does suggest that our perceptions participate in shaping the biological environment through which we navigate reality. This understanding carries practical implications. When we cultivate gratitude, compassion, curiosity, and emotional balance, we are not merely engaging in pleasant mental exercises. We are influencing patterns within living systems. We are participating in the ongoing dialogue between consciousness and biology. The Pong experiment reminds us that adaptation is woven deeply into life. The capacity to learn is not something we switch on occasionally. It is an ongoing process occurring beneath awareness every moment of every day. Our brains, bodies, and emotional systems are constantly gathering information and reorganizing themselves in response. Perhaps the most important question is not whether neurons in a dish can learn a simple game. Perhaps the deeper question is what their behavior reveals about our own untapped capacity for transformation. Because if even isolated neural networks demonstrate an inherent drive to reduce uncertainty and improve their interaction with the environment, then we may need to reconsider how much potential remains hidden within the human system itself. And once we begin exploring that possibility, another fascinating layer emerges, one that forces us to examine whether consciousness is merely observing biological change, or whether it is actively participating in the process as it unfolds. And that possibility opens a doorway into one of the most compelling questions in modern science. Is consciousness simply a product of biological activity, or does it play a more active role in shaping the activity itself? I find this question fascinating because the more we learn about the brain, the more we discover that observation and experience cannot always be separated as neatly as we once believed. Think about what happens when we learn a new skill. At first, the task feels unfamiliar. Every movement requires effort. Every decision demands attention. Yet with repetition, something changes. Neural pathways become more efficient. The behavior becomes natural. What was once difficult becomes automatic. The physical structure of the brain literally changes through experience. This phenomenon, known as neuroplasticity, has transformed our understanding of human potential. It reveals that the brain is not a fixed machine built once and left unchanged. Instead, it is a living system continuously reshaping itself in response to thoughts, emotions, actions, and environments. In many ways, the neurons that learn Pong demonstrate a simplified version of this principle. Given feedback and opportunity for adaptation, the system reorganized itself. Human beings possess this same capacity on an enormously greater scale. Every conversation influences us. Every memory influences us. Every emotional experience leaves traces within neural networks. And perhaps most importantly, every repeated pattern strengthens the pathways associated with that pattern. This is why habits become so powerful. The brain becomes efficient at what it practices. If we practice worry, the brain becomes skilled at finding reasons to worry. If we practice resentment, the brain becomes skilled at generating resentment. If we practice gratitude, compassion, creativity, or resilience, those pathways become increasingly accessible as well. The nervous system is always learning. The question is, what are we teaching it? This perspective shifts responsibility in an interesting way. Many people spend years waiting for external circumstances to create internal change. They believe confidence will arrive once success appears. They believe peace will emerge once problems disappear. They believe fulfillment will come after reaching some future destination. Yet biology suggests a different possibility. Internal states themselves can become part of the process that creates future outcomes. The emotions we repeatedly cultivate influence how we perceive opportunities. They influence how we interact with others. They influence the decisions we make. They influence the energy we bring into every situation. Over time, these effects accumulate. What begins as an internal pattern often becomes an external reality. This does not mean life is entirely under conscious control. Unexpected events happen. Challenges arise. Loss, uncertainty, and hardship are unavoidable aspects of the human experience. But even within those realities, we retain a remarkable capacity to influence how we respond. And response may be one of the most important forms of power available to us. When researchers watched neurons adapting to Pong, they were witnessing a system responding to information. Human beings are constantly doing the same thing. The difference is that our information includes stories, memories, beliefs, expectations, relationships, emotions, and cultural influences. We are navigating an incredibly rich informational environment. Every day, our nervous system asks a silent question: what kind of world am I living in? The answer shapes biology. If the world appears threatening, defensive systems activate. If the world appears supportive, growth-oriented systems become more accessible. This process often occurs beneath conscious awareness, yet its effects can be profound. That is why emotional regulation matters. Not because difficult emotions are bad, not because fear, sadness, or anger should be suppressed, but because awareness allows us to engage with emotions rather than becoming trapped inside them. Emotions contain information. They signal needs. They reveal perceptions. They highlight areas requiring attention. When we learn to observe emotional experiences without being overwhelmed by them, we create space for wiser choices. This may be one of the most practical expressions of consciousness, the ability to witness our internal experience rather than automatically reacting to it. The ability to pause, to reflect, to choose, to redirect attention intentionally. Interestingly, this capacity appears closely connected to many practices that have existed across human cultures for thousands of years. Breathing techniques, contemplation, mindfulness, focused attention, self-reflection. While these practices developed long before modern neuroscience, many now appear consistent with what researchers are discovering about nervous system regulation and brain function. The wisdom may be ancient, the language is modern, yet both seem to point toward a similar understanding. Human beings possess a greater capacity for self-directed transformation than we once imagined. The Pong experiment becomes especially intriguing when viewed through this lens. The neurons did not require verbal instructions. They did not need motivational speeches. They responded to patterns of information. In a sense, they adapted because adaptation was embedded within their nature. Perhaps the same principle applies to us. Perhaps growth is not something we force. Perhaps growth is something we allow. When conditions support learning, learning naturally occurs. When conditions support healing, healing becomes more possible. When conditions support connection, connection emerges more easily. The challenge is that modern life often floods us with signals that compete for our attention. Constant stimulation, constant distraction, constant urgency. Under these conditions, many people lose contact with the deeper rhythms operating within their own biology. They become disconnected from subtle signals that guide balance and well-being. Yet those signals never disappear. The body continues communicating. The nervous system continues adapting. The brain continues learning. Every moment becomes part of an ongoing conversation between experience and biology. And when we begin paying attention to that conversation, we often discover something surprising. We are influencing it far more than we realize. Not through force, not through denial, not through wishful thinking, but through the countless small choices that shape perception, emotion, attention, and behavior. Each choice becomes information. Each experience becomes instruction. Each moment becomes part of the blueprint from which future patterns emerge, which leads us toward an even deeper mystery surrounding the neurons that learn Pong. Because once adaptation is clearly visible at the cellular level, we must begin asking whether the drive toward learning itself is simply a mechanical process, or whether it hints at an organizing principle that extends far beyond what conventional models currently explain. And that question invites us into territory where science becomes not only a tool for measurement, but also a lens through which we examine the deeper patterns woven throughout life itself. When I look at experiments like the neurons that learn Pong, I am reminded that every major scientific discovery begins with a moment of curiosity. Something unexpected appears, an observation challenges existing assumptions. Suddenly what seemed obvious no longer feels complete. This is exactly where meaningful exploration begins. For centuries, human beings have attempted to understand what makes life different from non-living matter. We have analyzed chemistry, mapped biological systems, and studied the electrical activity of the brain. These efforts have revealed extraordinary insights. Yet some of the most fundamental questions remain open. Why does life continuously organize itself? Why does it adapt? Why does it learn? Why does it strive toward greater complexity? These questions become increasingly intriguing when we recognize that living systems are not static structures, they are dynamic processes. Your body today is not physically identical to the body you had years ago. Cells have been replaced, proteins have been rebuilt, neural connections have shifted. Yet despite these ongoing changes, a sense of continuity remains. Something preserves coherence amid constant transformation. This is one reason the concept of information has become so important in modern science. Many researchers now view life not merely as matter, but as matter organized by information. The molecules themselves are important. The structure is important. But the patterns governing those structures may be even more significant. Imagine a book. The physical paper matters. The ink matters. Yet the true value lies in the information arranged upon the page. Without the pattern, the paper is simply paper. Without organization, the ink becomes meaningless marks. Life appears to operate according to a similar principle. The information embedded within biological systems guides growth, adaptation, and function. The neurons in the Pong experiment were responding to information. Human beings spend every moment immersed in information, not only external information, but internal information as well. Thoughts are information. Emotions are information. Memories are information. Beliefs are information. Expectations are information. Every one of these influences how the nervous system interprets reality. This is why two people can experience the same event and create entirely different futures from it. The event itself may be identical. The interpretation is not. And interpretation shapes response. Response shapes behavior. Behavior shapes experience. Experience shapes biology. A powerful feedback loop emerges. When we begin understanding this process, we also begin understanding why awareness matters. Awareness creates the possibility of choice. Without awareness, old patterns tend to repeat automatically. The nervous system follows familiar routes. The brain conserves energy by relying on established pathways. This efficiency is useful in many situations, yet it can also keep us trapped in patterns that no longer serve us. Many people carry beliefs formed years earlier. Some originated during childhood, some emerged through difficult experiences. Some developed through repeated emotional conditioning. Over time, these beliefs become so familiar that they feel like objective reality. Yet often, they are simply interpretations that have been reinforced repeatedly. The fascinating aspect of neuroplasticity is that it demonstrates change remains possible. The brain can learn. The nervous system can adapt. New pathways can emerge. This does not happen overnight, but it does happen. Every time we practice a new perspective, we strengthen new patterns. Every time we respond differently to a familiar challenge, we alter the trajectory of future responses. Every time we consciously redirect attention, the biology receives new instructions. In this sense, transformation is not a single event. It is an ongoing process of communication between consciousness and the systems through which consciousness expresses itself. This understanding becomes especially important when discussing stress. Modern life exposes many people to prolonged psychological pressure. The body often reacts to imagined threats in ways similar to physical threats. The nervous system cannot always distinguish between a dangerous situation and a vividly rehearsed fear. As a result, many individuals spend significant portions of their lives activating survival mechanisms even when immediate danger is absent. The biological consequences can be substantial. Energy becomes redirected. Recovery processes become disrupted. Attention narrows. Creativity diminishes. Perspective contracts. The system becomes focused primarily on protection. From an evolutionary perspective, this response makes sense. Survival required vigilance, yet growth requires something different. Growth requires enough safety for exploration, enough stability for learning, enough openness for adaptation. This is where emotional balance becomes so valuable. Balance does not mean eliminating negative experiences. It means developing the capacity to move through them without becoming permanently defined by them. Just as neurons adapted when conditions provided meaningful feedback, human beings thrive when conditions support learning rather than constant defense. I often find it remarkable that some of the most profound shifts in life begin with seemingly small adjustments. A new habit, a new interpretation, a new conversation, a new practice of awareness. These changes may appear insignificant initially, yet because living systems are interconnected, small changes can influence larger patterns over time. A single shift in perspective may alter behavior. Altered behavior may influence relationships. Relationships may influence emotional states. Emotional states may influence biological processes. The ripple effects can extend far beyond the original change. This perspective encourages patience. Many people underestimate the power of consistent small actions because the results are not immediately visible. Yet biology often operates through accumulation. Tiny adjustments repeated consistently can eventually produce extraordinary outcomes. The neurons learning Pong did not master the task instantly. Adaptation occurred through ongoing interaction with feedback. Human transformation follows a similar principle. Growth unfolds through repetition, refinement, and continued engagement. Every experience becomes part of the process. Every challenge becomes information. Every success becomes information. Every setback becomes information. The question is not whether learning is occurring. Learning is always occurring. The question is whether we are becoming conscious participants in that learning process. Because once we recognize that our thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and experiences are continuously shaping biological pathways, a new possibility emerges. We begin to see ourselves not as passive observers being carried along by circumstances, but as active participants in an evolving relationship between awareness and biology. And as that realization deepens, another intriguing possibility comes into focus, one that may fundamentally change how we think about human potential. Because if learning, adaptation, and self-organization are woven into life at every level, then the next question becomes whether these same principles might reveal capacities within the human experience that science is only beginning to explore. And that possibility encourages us to look beyond the experiment itself and toward a broader understanding of what it means to be human in a universe filled with living, adaptive systems. One of the most fascinating aspects of modern science is that it continually reveals layers of complexity hidden beneath ordinary experience. What appears simple on the surface often turns out to be part of an intricate network of relationships, feedback loops, and patterns. The human body is a perfect example. For many years, biology was often described as a collection of separate systems performing independent tasks. The brain handled thinking, the heart pumped blood, the immune system fought disease. Each component appeared to operate within its own domain. Today, a different picture is emerging. Researchers increasingly recognize that these systems communicate continuously. Information flows in multiple directions. Signals travel through chemical pathways, electrical activity, hormones, neurotransmitters, and countless other mechanisms. The body behaves less like a machine assembled from isolated parts and more like an interconnected ecosystem. This insight has profound implications. When one part of the system changes, other parts respond. When emotional states shift, physiological responses often follow. When beliefs influence perception, perception can influence behavior. When behavior changes, biology may adapt accordingly. Everything participates in an ongoing conversation. This is why the idea of separation can sometimes become misleading. We often speak as though mind and body are distinct entities interacting occasionally, yet our daily experience suggests something far more integrated. Consider a moment of genuine excitement. Before a single word is spoken, the body responds. Heart rate changes, breathing shifts, energy increases, attention sharpens. The experience is simultaneously mental and physical. Or consider anxiety. A future event that has not yet occurred can trigger real physiological reactions in the present moment. The body responds to perceived reality as though it were immediate reality. This illustrates an important principle. Our experience of life is shaped not only by events themselves, but also by the meanings we assign to those events. Meaning matters, interpretation matters, expectation matters. The neurons that learned Pong adapted according to the information available to them. Human beings are constantly adapting according to information as well. The difference is that our informational environment includes stories. Stories about ourselves, stories about our limitations, stories about our strengths, stories about what we believe is possible. These narratives become powerful because the brain tends to organize experience around them. If someone believes they are incapable of growth, evidence supporting that belief often becomes highly visible. Opportunities for change may be overlooked. Potential remains unexplored. The nervous system continues reinforcing familiar patterns. Conversely, when someone believes growth is possible, attention often shifts toward learning opportunities. Challenges become information rather than proof of failure. Mistakes become feedback rather than permanent definitions. The biology begins supporting a different trajectory. This is not magical thinking. It is a reflection of how perception influences behavior and how behavior influences outcomes. What we repeatedly focus upon shapes the way we engage with reality. Over time, engagement shapes experience. This principle becomes especially relevant when examining resilience. Some individuals encounter adversity and become trapped within cycles of helplessness. Others encounter similar adversity and emerge stronger, wiser, and more adaptable. Why does this happen? The answer is complex, but one factor appears consistently. The meaning assigned to the experience often influences the outcome. Those who view challenges as opportunities for learning frequently develop greater resilience than those who view challenges solely as evidence of limitation. Again, awareness becomes essential. Without awareness, interpretation occurs automatically. Old beliefs filter incoming information. Past experiences dictate present reactions. The future becomes an extension of the past. Awareness interrupts this cycle. It allows us to observe our patterns, to question assumptions, to recognize emotional habits, to notice recurring narratives. And once we notice them, we gain the ability to choose differently. This may be one of the most transformative capacities available to human beings. The ability to consciously participate in our own development, not by controlling every circumstance, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by influencing how we respond to the information life provides. In many ways, learning itself is an act of transformation. Every new insight alters the structure of the brain. Every meaningful experience leaves traces within neural networks. Every moment of reflection reorganizes connections. The person who begins reading a book is not exactly the same person who finishes it. Knowledge changes us. Experience changes us. Awareness changes us. The process is continuous. Yet, because the changes occur gradually, we often fail to appreciate their significance. The neurons in the Pong experiment make this process visible in a simplified form. Adaptation can be observed. Learning can be measured. Patterns can be tracked. Within human life, the same principles operate across vastly larger scales. Relationships shape neural pathways. Education shapes neural pathways. Emotional experiences shape neural pathways. Attention shapes neural pathways. Even the questions we ask shape neural pathways. Questions direct awareness. Awareness directs focus. Focus influences learning. Learning influences biology. This is why curiosity may be one of the most powerful forces in personal growth. Curiosity keeps systems open. It invites exploration. It encourages flexibility. It prevents rigid conclusions from becoming permanent limitations. A curious mind remains capable of adaptation, and adaptation is one of life's defining characteristics. Every living system adapts. Every living system learns. Every living system responds to changing conditions. Human beings possess a unique advantage within this process. We can become aware of adaptation while it is occurring. We can observe ourselves learning. We can intentionally influence the environments that shape us. We can cultivate habits that support growth. We can choose experiences that expand perception. We can consciously direct attention toward possibilities rather than limitations. This does not guarantee a life free from difficulty. No biological system is exempt from challenge, yet it does suggest that potential may be far greater than many people assume. The more science reveals about neuroplasticity, emotional regulation, learning, and adaptation, the more it becomes apparent that human development is not fixed. We are not static beings moving through a predetermined reality. We are dynamic participants in an ongoing process of transformation. And when we view the neurons that learn Pong through this wider lens, they become more than an unusual laboratory achievement. They become a reminder that learning is woven into the fabric of life itself, a reminder that adaptation is not the exception but the rule. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that beneath our habits, beneath our assumptions, and beneath the stories we have accepted about who we are, there may exist capacities waiting to emerge once the right conditions invite them forward, capacities that challenge conventional ideas about the limits of human consciousness and open entirely new questions about where the next frontier of discovery may ultimately lead. And when we begin exploring that frontier, we encounter a realization that is both humbling and empowering. Much of what we consider fixed about ourselves may actually be far more flexible than we once believed. For generations, people have been taught to think of their abilities, emotional tendencies, and even aspects of their personality as relatively permanent traits. We often hear statements such as, "That's just who I am," or "I've always been this way." These beliefs can feel convincing because they are reinforced through years of repeated experience. Yet modern neuroscience paints a more dynamic picture. The brain is not merely recording our lives like a camera. It is actively interpreting, filtering, reorganizing, and updating information. Every experience leaves an imprint, and every imprint has the potential to influence future experiences. This means that what we call identity is not simply a static object. It is an ongoing process, a living pattern, a continuously evolving relationship between memory, perception, biology, and awareness. The significance of this idea cannot be overstated. If identity is a process rather than a fixed structure, then growth becomes more than wishful thinking. It becomes a biological possibility. The neurons that learned Pong did not remain exactly as they were at the beginning of the experiment. Through interaction with feedback, they adapted. Human beings undergo a similar process throughout life. The difference is that our feedback comes from countless sources: our families, our friendships, our education, our successes, our disappointments, our victories, our failures. Every interaction becomes information, and information shapes adaptation. One reason this matters is because many people unknowingly continue living from old patterns that no longer reflect their present reality. A difficult experience from years ago may still influence current decisions. An old belief about limitation may continue guiding behavior long after the circumstances that created it have disappeared. The nervous system learns efficiently, but it does not always distinguish between what is useful now and what was useful in the past. This is where conscious awareness becomes transformative. Awareness allows us to examine the patterns running beneath our behavior. It allows us to ask questions. Is this belief still serving me? Is this emotional response appropriate to the present moment? Is this pattern helping me grow or keeping me confined? Without awareness, these questions rarely arise. Patterns simply repeat. The familiar becomes automatic. Yet the moment awareness enters the process, new possibilities emerge. This is one reason reflection has played such an important role throughout human history. Long before advanced neuroscience existed, people recognized the value of examining their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Today, scientific research increasingly supports the idea that reflective practices can influence attention, emotional regulation, and neural activity. The ancient intuition and the modern evidence appear to converge on a similar insight. Self-awareness changes us, not because awareness magically solves every problem, but because awareness creates options, and options create freedom. Imagine driving a vehicle along a road you have traveled thousands of times. Eventually, the route becomes automatic. You stop noticing details. You stop questioning directions. You simply continue following the established path. Many psychological patterns operate in exactly the same way. Thoughts become habitual. Emotions become habitual. Reactions become habitual. Entire ways of experiencing reality become habitual. The challenge is that habits are not always aligned with our highest potential. Some habits were created in response to fear. Some emerged from uncertainty. Some formed during periods of stress. What once served as protection may later become limitation. This does not mean those patterns are wrong. It simply means they deserve examination, because every pattern carries consequences, and every consequence influences future experience. The neurons that adapted to Pong illustrate a fundamental truth about life. Systems learn from outcomes. Human beings are no exception. If a behavior repeatedly produces a particular result, the nervous system takes note. If an emotional pattern becomes familiar, the brain becomes increasingly efficient at reproducing it. Over time, these learned responses can feel natural even when they no longer serve us. Fortunately, the same mechanisms that create patterns can also transform them. New experiences create new information. New information creates new possibilities. Repeated possibilities become new habits. New habits become new patterns. Gradually, the system reorganizes itself. This process often unfolds more slowly than people expect. Modern culture frequently promotes the idea of instant transformation, a single breakthrough, a single technique, a single moment that changes everything. While profound moments certainly occur, lasting change usually develops through consistent engagement. Biology learns through repetition. The brain strengthens what it practices. The nervous system becomes skilled at what it repeatedly experiences. This means that small actions matter. A daily moment of reflection matters. A conscious pause before reacting matters. A decision to redirect attention matters. A commitment to emotional awareness matters. Individually, these actions may seem insignificant. Collectively, they become powerful. They provide the nervous system with new information. They offer alternative pathways. They create opportunities for adaptation. But what fascinates me is that many of the most meaningful transformations occur beneath the surface long before visible results appear. Seeds grow underground before they emerge above the soil. Neural pathways strengthen before behavior changes become obvious. Biological shifts often precede external outcomes. This can make growth difficult to recognize in real time. People may assume nothing is happening, yet important processes are already underway. The neurons in the laboratory dish were adapting moment by moment, even before the full results became visible. Human development often follows a similar pattern. Change accumulates quietly. Learning accumulates quietly. Awareness accumulates quietly. Then, one day, what once seemed impossible begins to feel natural. a new perspective emerges, a new emotional response appears, a new level of resilience becomes available. And suddenly it becomes clear that transformation was occurring all along. Perhaps this is one of the most hopeful lessons hidden within the story of neurons learning a simple game. Growth is not reserved for a select few. Adaptation is woven into life itself. Learning is part of our biological inheritance. The capacity for change exists within us from the very beginning. The real question is whether we choose to engage consciously with that capacity. Because once we understand that every thought, every emotion, every experience, and every act of attention contributes to the ongoing shaping of our internal world, we begin to recognize that human potential may be far less constrained than conventional assumptions suggest, and that realization leads directly into an even deeper exploration of how consciousness itself might interact with the extraordinary adaptive intelligence already present within the living systems of the body. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation becomes even more intriguing, because we are no longer talking only about neurons, biology, or laboratory experiments. We are talking about the relationship between awareness and the living systems that make awareness possible. One of the greatest mysteries in science remains consciousness itself. We can measure electrical activity in the brain. We can observe neural networks communicating. We can identify regions associated with memory, language, emotion, and decision-making. Yet, despite these extraordinary advances, the subjective experience of being conscious remains difficult to fully explain. Why does awareness exist at all? How does the physical activity of billions of neurons give rise to the experience of thoughts, emotions, imagination, and self-reflection? These questions continue to challenge researchers around the world. The experiment involving neurons learning Pong does not answer them, but it does contribute something valuable. It reminds us that living systems possess capacities that are often more sophisticated than our assumptions. Again and again, science reveals that life is not passive. Life responds. Life adapts. Life organizes. Life learns. And the deeper we investigate these processes, the more remarkable they appear. Consider the human brain for a moment. Within it exist roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected through vast networks of communication. Every second, enormous amounts of information are processed, integrated, filtered, and interpreted. Most of this activity occurs without conscious awareness. Your heart continues beating. Your breathing adjusts. Your immune system performs countless tasks. Memories are organized. Sensory information is processed. Patterns are recognized. All of this happens beneath the surface of conscious thought. In many ways, consciousness appears to emerge from an ocean of hidden activity. Yet, the relationship works both ways. While unconscious systems influence conscious experience can also influence unconscious systems. This is where the discussion becomes especially relevant to everyday life. Because the thoughts we repeatedly entertain do not simply disappear. They influence emotional states. Emotional states influence physiology. Physiology influences perception. Perception influences future thoughts. A continuous cycle unfolds. Many people imagine consciousness as a passive observer watching events happen. But increasing evidence suggests awareness participates in shaping experience, not necessarily by controlling every external event, but by influencing the internal conditions through which those events are interpreted and responded to. This distinction is important. We cannot always choose what happens around us. We can, however, develop greater influence over how we engage with what happens. And that influence can be profound. Imagine two individuals facing uncertainty. Externally, their circumstances may be nearly identical. Internally, however, their experiences may differ dramatically. One becomes overwhelmed by fear and anticipates failure. The other approaches the situation with curiosity and resilience. The challenge remains the same. The biological response does not. Different emotional states create different physiological environments. Different physiological environments support different behaviors. Different behaviors create different outcomes. This does not guarantee success. Life is far too complex for simple guarantees. Yet it does demonstrate that internal experience matters. The story of neurons learning Pong invites us to appreciate the importance of feedback. The cells adapted because information guided adaptation. Human beings receive feedback constantly. The challenge is that we often ignore some of the most important forms of feedback available to us. We pay attention to external results while overlooking internal signals. We notice achievements but ignore exhaustion. We pursue goals while neglecting emotional well-being. We focus on productivity while forgetting the biological system supporting that productivity. Eventually, the body responds. Stress accumulates, energy declines, clarity diminishes. The system attempts to communicate. What fascinates me is that the body is continuously offering information. Every emotional reaction contains information. Every physical sensation contains information. Every recurring thought pattern contains information. The question is whether we are listening. Awareness begins with observation. Not judgment, not criticism. Observation. The ability to notice what is happening within us without immediately attempting to suppress, justify, or escape it. This simple capacity can be surprisingly transformative because what remains unconscious tends to operate automatically. What becomes conscious can be understood. What is understood can be influenced. This principle appears repeatedly throughout both science and personal development. Greater awareness creates greater flexibility. Greater flexibility creates greater adaptability. And adaptability is one of the defining characteristics of thriving systems. The neurons in the laboratory adapted because adaptation was possible. Human beings possess an extraordinary version of that same capability. We can adapt not only physically but psychologically and emotionally as well. We can learn new skills, develop new perspectives, build new habits, strengthen new patterns of thought, cultivate new emotional responses. The potential for change remains present throughout life. This realization carries significant implications. If adaptation is a fundamental characteristic of living systems, then perhaps many limitations we accept as permanent are not as fixed as they appear. Some certainly reflect genuine constraints. Reality contains boundaries. Biology contains limits. Circumstances matter, yet within those boundaries often exists far more flexibility than we initially assume. History provides countless examples. Individuals overcoming enormous adversity. Communities rebuilding after devastation. People discovering strengths they never knew they possessed. These stories remind us that potential often reveals itself only when challenged. The capacity existed beforehand. The circumstances simply provided an opportunity for it to emerge. In this sense, challenges can serve a surprising function. While difficult and sometimes painful, they often reveal capabilities that comfort alone might never uncover. Resilience develops through engagement. Wisdom develops through experience. Growth develops through adaptation. The neurons learning Pong adapted because they encountered conditions that required adaptation. Human beings frequently discover new dimensions of themselves through a similar process. Not because struggle is inherently desirable, but because challenge provides information, and information drives learning. Perhaps this is why curiosity remains so valuable. Curiosity keeps us open to information. It prevents rigid assumptions from becoming permanent barriers. It encourages exploration. It encourages learning. Most importantly, it encourages humility. The willingness to recognize that there is always more to discover. The Pong experiment serves as a reminder of this principle. What began as a scientific investigation became an invitation to ask larger questions about intelligence, learning, adaptation, and the nature of living systems. And as we continue examining those questions, another fascinating possibility begins to emerge, one suggesting that the future of understanding human consciousness may depend not only on studying the brain in isolation, but also on exploring how the brain, body, emotions, environment, and awareness function together as parts of a deeply interconnected system whose full capabilities we are only beginning to comprehend. And when we begin viewing human experience through the lens of interconnected systems, an entirely new perspective starts to emerge, one that challenges the habit of seeing ourselves as separate from the processes that shape our lives. For much of modern history, science advanced by breaking complex systems into smaller and smaller pieces. This approach produced remarkable discoveries. By studying individual cells, individual organs, individual molecules, and individual neural circuits, researchers uncovered countless mechanisms that make life possible. Yet a growing number of scientists now recognize that understanding the pieces is only part of the story. The relationships between the pieces matter just as much. A single neuron by itself tells us very little about a thought. A single heart cell tells us very little about love, motivation, or emotional resilience. A single molecule tells us very little about the richness of human experience. Meaning emerges through connection. Patterns emerge through interaction. Life emerges through relationships. This principle appears everywhere we look. The cells of the body communicate continuously. Neural networks communicate continuously. Human beings communicate continuously. Even our relationship with the environment involves a constant exchange of information. Nothing exists in complete isolation. The neurons that learned Pong demonstrated adaptation through interaction. Without feedback, learning could not occur. Without relationship, adaptation would have been impossible. Human growth follows the same pattern. We are shaped by the relationships we maintain, the conversations we have, the environments we inhabit, the information we consume, the emotions we repeatedly experience. Each becomes part of an ongoing process of adaptation. This understanding highlights something many people overlook. Our environment is not only physical, it is informational. Every day we expose ourselves to streams of information that influence perception and behavior. Some information encourages curiosity, some encourages fear. Some encourages creativity, some encourages limitation. The nervous system absorbs far more than we consciously recognize. Over time, repeated exposure to particular patterns begins shaping expectations about reality. Expectations matter because they influence attention, and attention is one of the most powerful forces in human experience. Where attention goes, learning follows. Where attention goes, neural pathways strengthen. Where attention goes, perception becomes refined. This is why two people can live in the same world, yet experience vastly different realities. One person's attention becomes trained toward possibility. Another person's attention becomes trained toward threat. Both observe the same environment. Both notice different things. The result is not merely psychological. It becomes biological. Different perceptions generate different emotional responses. Different emotional responses influence physiology. Different physiological states influence future perceptions. The cycle continues. The remarkable aspect of this process is that awareness allows us to participate in it consciously. Most living systems adapt automatically. Human beings can adapt intentionally. We can examine the patterns influencing our attention. We can question assumptions. We can choose what information deserves our focus. This capacity represents a unique form of freedom. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom within circumstances. The ability to influence how experience is interpreted and integrated. The neurons in the Pong experiment adapted because feedback altered their behavior. Human beings possess access to a far richer form of feedback. We can reflect upon our experiences. We can learn from our mistakes. We can revise our beliefs. We can alter our habits. We can imagine alternative possibilities. These abilities dramatically expand the range of potential adaptation, and yet many people underestimate them. Why? Because transformation often happens gradually. The most important changes are frequently invisible at first. A shift in perspective may seem insignificant. A new habit may appear minor. A moment of self-awareness may feel ordinary. Yet each of these experiences introduces new information into the system. The brain responds. The nervous system responds. The body responds. Over time, small changes accumulate. Eventually, entirely new patterns emerge. Nature provides countless examples of this principle. A river-shaped stone, not through force alone, but through persistence. A seed becomes a tree through gradual development. Complex ecosystems emerge through countless interactions occurring over long periods of time. Life often grows through accumulation rather than sudden transformation. Human development appears to follow a similar pattern. This realization can be deeply encouraging. Many people become discouraged because they expect immediate results. When change is not instantly visible, they assume nothing is happening. Yet biology rarely works that way. Adaptation takes time. Learning takes time. Integration takes time. The neurons learning Pong did not transform in a single moment. Their adaptation emerged through repeated interaction with information. Likewise, human growth unfolds through repeated engagement with experience. Every choice contributes. Every thought contributes. Every emotional response contributes. Every act of awareness contributes. The cumulative effect can be extraordinary. What fascinates me most is that this process never truly stops. Even now, as you listen to these ideas, your brain is changing. Neural connections are being activated. Patterns are being evaluated. Information is being integrated. Learning is occurring. The same biological principles operating in the laboratory experiment are operating within you. The scale is different. The complexity is vastly greater, but the underlying reality remains. Living systems learn. Living systems adapt. Living systems reorganize themselves in response to experience. Perhaps this is why human potential remains such an important subject of exploration. We have a tendency to define ourselves by our current abilities, current circumstances, and current understanding. Yet all of these are temporary snapshots within a much larger process. The person you are today is not identical to the person you were years ago. And the person you become years from now will not be identical to the person you are today. Change is not an exception to life. Change is life. The real question is whether we engage with that process consciously or unconsciously, whether we become active participants in our development or passive recipients of conditioning, whether we allow old patterns to dictate the future or intentionally cultivate new possibilities. The neurons that learn Pong remind us that adaptation is deeply woven into the fabric of living systems. But perhaps their greatest lesson lies elsewhere. Perhaps it lies in the recognition that learning is not merely something we do. Learning is something we are. It is a continuous expression of life itself. And once we begin understanding learning in that way, we are naturally led toward an even deeper inquiry, one that asks whether the extraordinary adaptability observed throughout biology might ultimately reveal principles about consciousness, creativity, and human evolution that extend far beyond anything currently captured by conventional scientific models. And that inquiry may ultimately become one of the most important explorations of our time because it touches the very foundation of how we understand ourselves and our place within the unfolding story of life. When most people hear the word evolution, they immediately think of physical change occurring across vast stretches of time. They imagine biological traits gradually adapting through generations. While that perspective is certainly important, human evolution may involve more than physical development alone. There is also the evolution of awareness, the evolution of understanding, the evolution of how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the world around us. Unlike biological evolution, which often unfolds across centuries or millennia, psychological and emotional evolution can occur within a single lifetime. A person can transform their perspective, expand their understanding, develop greater resilience, cultivate deeper compassion, strengthen emotional intelligence. These changes may not alter physical anatomy in obvious ways, yet they profoundly influence the quality of human experience. This is why the study of adaptation remains so fascinating. Adaptation is not merely survival. At its highest expression, adaptation becomes growth. The neurons in the Pong experiment adapted to improve performance within their environment. Human beings possess the capacity to adapt in ways that extend beyond performance alone. We can adapt our beliefs. We can adapt our habits. We can adapt our emotional responses. We can adapt our understanding of reality itself. And every adaptation opens the door to new possibilities. What makes this especially significant is that the future is rarely determined by current circumstances alone. It is influenced by how we respond to those circumstances. Two individuals can begin from similar starting points and arrive at dramatically different destinations. The difference often lies not in the events they experience, but in the meanings they create from those experiences. Meaning acts like a lens. It shapes perception. It directs attention. It influences behavior, and behavior influences outcomes. Over time, these effects compound. Small differences in interpretation can eventually produce enormous differences in experience. This understanding highlights a powerful truth. Human beings are not merely shaped by reality. We are also shaped by our relationship to reality. That relationship is constantly evolving. Every new insight changes it. Every new experience changes it. Every moment of awareness changes it. The remarkable thing is that many of these changes begin internally long before they become visible externally. Consider someone learning a new language. For weeks or months, progress may seem slow. Vocabulary accumulates gradually. Patterns begin forming beneath conscious awareness. Then suddenly, understanding accelerates. Conversations become possible. Fluency begins emerging. The visible breakthrough is real, but it rests upon countless invisible changes that occurred beforehand. Personal growth often unfolds in a similar way. People frequently underestimate the importance of small moments because those moments appear insignificant in isolation. A single reflection, a single insight, a single decision to respond differently, a single act of emotional awareness. None seem dramatic, yet each introduces new information into the system. Each alters neural activity. Each contributes to future adaptation. Eventually, those small shifts accumulate into profound transformation. The neurons learning Pong offer a useful reminder of this principle. Learning did not appear from nowhere. It emerged through ongoing interaction with information. The same is true throughout human life. Every experience becomes part of the learning process. Every challenge becomes part of the learning process. Every success becomes part of the learning process. Even disappointment becomes part of the learning process. Nothing is wasted unless we refuse to learn from it. This perspective can fundamentally change how we view obstacles. Many people see obstacles as interruptions to progress. Yet obstacles often become the very conditions that stimulate growth. Without resistance, strength remains undeveloped. Without uncertainty, adaptability remains untested. Without challenge, many hidden capacities remain dormant. This does not mean we should seek suffering. It simply means that difficulty and growth are often more connected than they initially appear. The neurons in the laboratory adapted because they encountered a problem requiring adaptation. Human beings frequently discover new dimensions of themselves through similar encounters. A challenge reveals resilience. A setback reveals determination. A loss reveals wisdom. An uncertainty reveals creativity. Capabilities that were previously invisible begin emerging into awareness. In this sense, potential is often discovered rather than created. The capacity already exists. Experience simply reveals it. This realization carries an important implication. Many people underestimate themselves because they judge their capabilities based only on what has already been expressed. They assume that what is visible today represents the limits of what is possible tomorrow. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. Human beings continually exceed expectations. Individuals overcome circumstances that once seemed impossible. Communities achieve breakthroughs that once seemed unimaginable. Entire fields of knowledge expand beyond previous assumptions. The reason this happens is simple. Potential is rarely visible in its entirety. There is always more beneath the surface. The neurons that learned Pong surprised researchers because they revealed capacities that were not fully anticipated. Human beings often surprise themselves for the same reason. We carry abilities that remain dormant until conditions invite them forward. We possess strengths that remain hidden until challenges reveal them. We contain possibilities that remain unrealized until awareness brings them into focus. This may be one of the most hopeful lessons emerging from both science and personal experience. The future is not merely an extension of the past. Adaptation makes novelty possible. Learning makes transformation possible. Awareness makes conscious transformation possible. Every moment becomes an opportunity to participate in that process, not through force, not through perfection, but through engagement, through curiosity, through attention, through the willingness to remain open to growth. And perhaps that openness is where the deepest significance of the Pong experiment ultimately resides, because beyond the technology, beyond the neuroscience, and beyond the scientific achievement itself, it points toward a larger reality, one suggesting that life is continuously moving toward greater learning, greater adaptation, and greater complexity, inviting us to explore whether consciousness may be participating in an evolutionary journey whose full scope we have only just begun to glimpse. And if consciousness is participating in such a journey, then perhaps one of the most valuable questions we can ask is not where that journey ends, but how it unfolds through the choices we make every day. It is easy to become captivated by extraordinary discoveries. A laboratory experiment captures headlines. A scientific breakthrough sparks public imagination. New technologies reveal possibilities that once belonged only to speculation. Yet the greatest implications of these discoveries often emerge not in research facilities, but in ordinary human life. What does this understanding mean for the way we think, the way we feel, the way we relate to ourselves and others? The neurons that learn Pong remind us that adaptation is not an occasional event. It is a continuous process. Living systems are constantly responding to information, adjusting to circumstances, and reorganizing themselves based on experience. The same principle applies to us. Whether we recognize it or not, every day is shaping us. Every conversation is shaping us. Every habit is shaping us. Every emotional pattern is shaping us. Every focus of attention is shaping us. The question is not whether adaptation is occurring. The question is whether we are participating consciously in that adaptation. This distinction can make an enormous difference. Imagine two people exposed to the same stream of information. One consumes it passively. The other engages with it thoughtfully. One reacts automatically. The other reflects intentionally. Over time, the differences accumulate. Not because the information itself is different, but because the relationship to that information is different. Awareness changes the process. Awareness creates a space between stimulus and response. Within that space lies possibility. The ability to choose rather than simply react. The ability to evaluate rather than automatically accept. The ability to learn rather than merely repeat. This may be one of the defining characteristics of human growth, not the absence of conditioning, but the ability to become aware of conditioning. Not the elimination of habits, but the capacity to consciously shape them. Not the avoidance of influence, but the wisdom to choose influences carefully. The modern world presents a unique challenge in this regard. Never before have human beings been exposed to such vast quantities of information. Every day, countless messages compete for attention. Opinions, predictions, fears, aspirations, advertisements, and narratives flood the mind. Each carries the potential to influence perception. Each becomes part of the informational environment through which the nervous system operates. This makes conscious attention more important than ever. Attention is not merely a mental function. It is a biological force. What we repeatedly attend to influences neural activity. Neural activity influences learning. Learning influences future perception. The cycle continues. In many ways, attention functions like nourishment for the mind. Just as the body responds to what it consumes physically, the nervous system responds to what it consumes informationally. This realization invites a deeper level of responsibility, not responsibility in the sense of blame, responsibility in the sense of participation, the recognition that we are active contributors to our internal environment. Every thought we repeatedly cultivate becomes part of that environment. Every emotional state we reinforce becomes part of that environment. Every belief we continually revisit becomes part of that environment. Over time, the environment shapes adaptation. This perspective helps explain why seemingly small practices can have such significant effects. A few moments of reflection each day may appear insignificant. A brief pause before reacting may seem unimportant. A conscious effort to cultivate gratitude may appear simple, yet each introduces different information into the system. Each influences attention. Each influences perception. Each influences biology. The cumulative effect can be substantial. The neurons that learned Pong adapted because feedback guided adaptation. Human beings possess access to a uniquely powerful form of feedback. We can observe ourselves. We can reflect upon our experiences. We can evaluate the consequences of our actions. We can adjust our direction. This ability allows learning to become increasingly intentional. Rather than being carried entirely by unconscious patterns, we can participate consciously in shaping future patterns. Of course, this process is rarely perfect. Growth is seldom linear. Progress often includes setbacks. Old habits reappear. Challenges persist. Uncertainty remains. Yet none of these realities negate the possibility of transformation. In fact, they often become part of it. Every challenge provides information. Every mistake provides information. Every unexpected outcome provides information. The nervous system is always learning. The opportunity lies in learning consciously alongside it. What fascinates me is how often profound change begins with simple awareness. A person notices a recurring reaction, a recurring belief, a recurring emotional pattern. For the first time, they see it clearly. Nothing external has changed. Yet something important has happened. The pattern is no longer completely unconscious. Awareness has entered the process, and awareness changes possibilities. Once something can be observed, it can be questioned. Once questioned, it can be understood. Once understood, it can be transformed. This sequence appears again and again throughout personal development, psychology, and neuroscience. Observation precedes change. The neurons in the laboratory did not require self-reflection. Their adaptation occurred through biological feedback alone. Human beings possess the extraordinary ability to combine biological adaptation with conscious awareness. This combination may represent one of the most remarkable capacities within the human experience. We are simultaneously participants in life and observers of it. We can experience emotions while examining them. We can think thoughts while reflecting upon them. We can engage in behavior while evaluating its consequences. This creates opportunities unavailable to most other systems we know. It allows evolution not only of biology, but of understanding, not only of behavior, but of wisdom. And perhaps wisdom is where this entire exploration ultimately points. Because knowledge alone tells us what is possible. Wisdom helps us decide how to use what is possible. The experiment involving neurons learning Pong expanded our understanding of learning and adaptation. But its deeper significance may extend far beyond neuroscience. It may serve as a reminder that life itself is an ongoing process of learning, a continuous dialogue between experience and adaptation, between information and transformation, between what we are today and what we are capable of becoming tomorrow. And once we begin viewing ourselves through that lens, an even more profound question naturally arises, one that invites us to explore whether the future of human development will depend less on discovering entirely new capacities and more on awakening capacities that have been quietly present within us all along. And if those capacities have been present all along, then perhaps the real challenge is learning how to recognize them beneath the noise of everyday life. Most people spend much of their lives focused outward. We pay attention to responsibilities, deadlines, obligations, goals, and the countless demands competing for our energy. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. Practical concerns are part of being human. They help us navigate the world and contribute to our growth. Yet in the midst of that constant activity, something important can be overlooked: the inner processes through which we experience life. The neurons that learned Pong adapted because they continuously responded to information. Human beings are doing the same thing every moment. The difference is that much of our most influential information comes from within. Our interpretations, Our assumptions, our expectations, our emotional patterns, our beliefs about ourselves, these internal signals often shape experience just as powerfully as external events. In many cases, they shape how external events are perceived in the first place. This realization invites a subtle but significant shift in perspective. Instead of asking only what is happening around us, we can begin asking what is happening within us. How am I interpreting this situation? What assumptions am I bringing into this experience? What emotional patterns are influencing my response? What expectations are shaping my perception? Questions like these increase awareness, and awareness changes the quality of adaptation. Without awareness, adaptation often occurs automatically. Old habits guide behavior. Past experiences dictate reactions. Established patterns continue reinforcing themselves. With awareness, however, adaptation becomes more intentional. We gain the ability to influence the direction of our own development. This is where personal transformation often begins. Not with dramatic external changes, not with sudden breakthroughs, but with a deeper relationship to our own experience. The ability to observe ourselves honestly, the willingness to learn from what we observe, the courage to adjust when adjustment becomes necessary. These capacities may seem simple, yet they possess extraordinary power. Because every meaningful change begins with recognition. Before a habit can be changed, it must be noticed. Before a belief can be questioned, it must be recognized. Before a new possibility can emerge, awareness must create space for it. This process mirrors what we see throughout nature. Growth often begins invisibly. Roots develop before branches appear. Foundations form before structures rise. Preparation occurs before transformation becomes obvious. Human development follows a similar pattern. Many of the most important changes happen beneath the surface. Someone may appear unchanged externally while profound internal shifts are already underway. New perspectives are forming. New insights are emerging. New patterns are developing. Eventually, these internal changes begin expressing themselves through behavior, relationships, and choices. What once existed as possibility becomes reality. This gradual unfolding reminds us that growth is not always dramatic. Often, it is quiet, patient, incremental. The neurons learning Pong did not suddenly awaken with complete understanding. Their adaptation occurred step by step, moment by moment, interaction by interaction. Human growth frequently unfolds through the same process. Every experience contributes. Every reflection contributes. Every act of awareness contributes. Over time, the cumulative effect becomes significant. One reason this understanding matters is because many people become discouraged when change feels slow. They expect immediate results, immediate clarity, immediate transformation. When those expectations are not met, they conclude that growth is not occurring. Yet biology teaches a different lesson. Living systems often require time to integrate information. Neural pathways strengthen gradually. Habits develop gradually. Emotional resilience develops gradually. Patience becomes part of the process. The same principle appears in learning. A student may struggle with a subject for weeks before understanding suddenly emerges. An athlete may train for months before noticeable improvement appears. A musician may practice countless hours before mastery becomes visible. The breakthrough seems sudden. The preparation was not. Human consciousness appears to operate according to similar dynamics. Moments of insight often emerge from long periods of unseen development. The mind gathers information. The nervous system adapts. Patterns reorganize. Eventually, understanding crystallizes. What fascinates me is that this process reveals an important truth about potential. Potential is not always visible. In fact, much of it remains hidden until circumstances call it forward. The neurons that learned Pong demonstrated capabilities that would have remained unknown had the experiment never taken place. Human beings frequently discover hidden capacities in exactly the same way. Challenges reveal strengths. Responsibility reveals leadership. Adversity reveals resilience. Uncertainty reveals creativity. Experiences act as mirrors, showing us dimensions of ourselves we may never have recognized otherwise. This suggests that potential is less like a fixed quantity and more like a field of possibilities waiting to be explored. Some possibilities emerge easily. Others require effort. Others appear only under specific conditions. Yet many remain present regardless of whether we currently recognize them. This perspective can transform how we view ourselves. Instead of defining ourselves solely by present circumstances, we begin appreciating the dynamic nature of human development. We stop asking only who we are. We begin asking who we are becoming. That shift is profound because becoming implies movement, learning, adaptation, evolution. It recognizes that identity is not merely inherited from the past. It is continuously influenced by present choices. Every act of attention contributes to that process. Every interpretation contributes. Every emotional response contributes. Every decision contributes. The future is shaped not only by circumstances, but also by how we engage with those circumstances. The neurons learning Pong adapted because interaction changed them. Human beings are changed by interaction as well. Interaction with ideas, interaction with experiences, interaction with challenges, interaction with one another. Life itself becomes the classroom. Every day becomes part of the lesson. And perhaps that is one of the most extraordinary implications of this entire story. The experiment began as an investigation into biological learning, yet it ultimately points towards something much larger, a recognition that adaptation, growth, and transformation are woven into the fabric of life itself, continuously inviting us to explore deeper dimensions of awareness and possibility, while reminding us that the next stage of human development may depend not merely on what we discover about the brain, but on how consciously we participate in the ongoing process of becoming.
Deep dive analysis. What the neurons learning Pong reveal about you. When I step back from the experiment, human neurons in a dish learning to play Pong, I don't just see a strange laboratory achievement. I see a simplified mirror of something that is happening inside you right now in every moment of your life. Because what this experiment really reveals is not just about neurons, it is about learning itself. And learning is the hidden engine behind every change you've ever experienced. 1. The real lesson, life is continuous feedback learning. At its core, the Pong experiment is built on a simple principle, feedback. The neurons weren't thinking in the human sense, they weren't planning moves or understanding a game. Instead, they were receiving signals, success, error, correction, and gradually adjusting their firing patterns. That is learning in its most basic biological form. Now translate that into human life. Every experience you have is feedback. Asterisk, a conversation that goes well, feedback, asterisk, a mistake at work, feedback, asterisk, a strong emotional reaction, feedback, asterisk, a relationship conflict, feedback. Most people think learning only happens in classrooms, but biologically, your nervous system is learning all the time. A simple way to understand this is to imagine touching a hot surface. Your hand pulls away instantly. You don't decide in that moment. Your nervous system has already learned what danger feels like and responds automatically. Now expand that idea to emotions, habits, and beliefs. Your system is constantly adjusting itself based on what it experiences. 2. The brain doesn't just record life, it rewrites it. A common misunderstanding is that the brain works like a camera, passively storing experiences. But in reality, it works more like a sculptor. Every experience reshapes neural pathways. When you repeat a thought, such as worry, confidence, or self-doubt, you are strengthening a biological pattern. Think of it like walking through tall grass. Asterisk the first time it's difficult, asterisk the second time, easier. Asterisk, after many passes, a clear path forms. That path is what we call a habit or belief. This is why two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different interpretations. Their brains are not identical. recording devices. They are differently shaped learning systems. And just like the neurons in the dish, your system strengthens whatever patterns it repeats most often. 3. Emotions are not noise, they are data. One of the most important insights from neuroscience today is that emotions are not random interruptions. They are signals. Fear signals perceived threat. Sadness signals loss or disconnection. Anger signals boundary violation. Joy signals alignment or reward. In the Pong experiment, the neurons adjusted based on signals of success and error. In your life, emotions serve a similar role. They tell your system what is working and what is not. The problem is not emotions themselves. The problem is misunderstanding them. When someone ignores emotional signals repeatedly, the system doesn't stop communicating, it simply becomes louder. That is why chronic stress, burnout, and emotional overwhelm often develop gradually. The system is trying to get attention. 4. Conscious awareness is the game changer. Here is where human beings differ from simple neural networks in a dish. We can observe ourselves, we can notice patterns while they are happening. This is the foundation of transformation. Without awareness, you repeat patterns automatically. With awareness, you can interrupt and reshape them. For example, asterisk, you notice you react defensively in conversations. Asterisk, instead of reacting instantly, you pause. Asterisk, that pause creates space. Asterisk, in that space, a new response becomes possible. That small moment of awareness is powerful. It is where biology meets choice. In a sense, awareness is like stepping outside the system just enough to influence it. 5. The mind-body loop. Why everything is connected. Your thoughts don't stay in your head. They affect your body, and your body affects your thoughts. This is a continuous loop. Asterisk, a stressful thought increases heart rate. Asterisk, a changed body state influences perception. Asterisk, that perception produces more stressful thoughts. Or the opposite. Asterisk, a calm breath slows the nervous system. Asterisk, a calmer body produces clearer thinking. Asterisk, clear thinking reduces emotional reactivity. This loop explains why change is not just mental, it is physiological. It also explains why practices like breathing, movement, and reflection have such a strong impact. They are not spiritual tricks, they are biological regulation tools. 6. Real life application. How to work with your nervous system. If we translate everything from the Pong experiment into practical life wisdom, it becomes surprisingly simple. Here are a few ways to apply it. 1. Notice repetition. Ask yourself, asterisk, what thoughts do I repeat most often? Asterisk, what emotional patterns appear daily? Repetition is shaping your neural pathways. 2. Pause before reaction. Even a 2-3 second pause can interrupt automatic responses. That pause is where change begins. 3. Label emotions. Instead of becoming them, instead of I am angry, try I am experiencing anger. This creates distance and awareness. 4. Feed your system better input. Your nervous system is always learning from conversations, media, asterisk environment, asterisk self-talk. Change the input and you gradually change the output. 5. Practice small, consistent shifts. You don't need dramatic transformation. You need repetition. Small changes, repeated daily, reshape the system over time, just like the neurons in the experiment. 7. The deeper insight. You are always being shaped. The question is how. The most important takeaway is not that you can control everything. You can't. Life will always provide unexpected feedback. The real insight is this. You are always being shaped by experience. The only question is whether that shaping is unconscious or conscious. The neurons in the dish adapted automatically, but you have something more powerful. You can observe adaptation happening in real time. You can participate in it. You can influence it. You can guide it. Final reflection. When I look at the Pong experiment, I don't see a machine learning a game. I see a fundamental principle of life expressing itself in its simplest form. Living systems learn through feedback. And if that is true at the level of neurons, then it is also true at the level of human experience, which means your life is not fixed. It is not static. It is responsive. And every moment is another opportunity to shape the direction of that response quietly, gradually, and continuously through the choices you make, the attention you give, and the awareness you bring to the life you are already living